Yogurt, fish, carrot, avocado stir-fry, grass, mint tongue slice, cheese, food tongue. Food tongue, grass, tongue, cheese, ham sandwich. Mint tongue slice, cheese, food tongue, grass, food. Dough, plantain, peach sauce, food tongue, fish, food tongue. Spinach, English muffin tongue. 20 years ago today, a group of math campers decided to play a language creation game. The rule was that all the words in the language had to be food words, and if we wanted to develop the language or teach the language to someone new, and really these are both instances of the same thing, trying to introduce a new word to someone, we had to do so entirely in food tongue itself. No cheating and explaining to someone what a word meant in English. The experiment was largely a success. Within a few hours of babbling, we were able to work out a protocol for introducing new words and confirming our understanding. Within a few weeks, we had a language capable of holding conversations in and even doing some basic mathematics. But there was a lot of what some might call cheating going on, at least if the hope was to create a new language entirely separate from English. Some words we were able to copy over directly from English, while many other words were puns of some sort, words chosen to resemble English words in some way. But food tongue also reflected the structure of English at its core in some ways. Questions about what words were important to establish early were based on our experience of English, and when one word had multiple related meanings in English, we would often carry that polysemy into food tongue. Our words for and, the conjunction, and addition, the mathematical concept, were the same, for instance. We didn't always copy over the structure of English, though. We used the same word for make and do, which one would expect more of native Latin speakers, for instance, a language that has one word for both. Inspired by languages such as Warlbiri or some Khoisan languages, which supposedly do not have words for quantities above 2, we thought it would be funny if our language for mathematicians didn't have any numbers above 4, just a word for 5 or more. Of course, one can't decipher a language purely on structure and the suggestion that some of the words are puns alone. We still had to do the work of pointing at objects, acting out meanings, or acting out entire conversations. Mathematicians are naturally curious about everything theoretical, so we had a lot of questions about the process of creating a mutual language in that language itself. Was it actually necessary for all of us to have a language in common? The answer is a resounding spinach. Throughout history, we have hundreds of instances of languages being formed between people that do not share a language in common, and these languages are called pidgins. If you've heard of the language Tok-Pisin, its name comes from a phonetic transformation on the words talk and pigeon, although it's now considered a Creole since it has native speakers and has stabilized and expanded in structure and vocabulary to accommodate its use as a first language. Interestingly, there's an international sign language pidgin developed by sign language users to communicate at international conferences, so that's neat. Food tongue shows many of the linguistic features that tend to be common among pidgins. As we've seen, food tongue borrows heavily, where it can, from the native language of its speakers. Words in food tongue have a complete lack of inflection, that is, usually endings or variations of a word to mark their grammatical roles. For instance, in English, we still mark case, whether a word is a subject or object or possessive or whatever, in our pronouns. We also vary up our verbs by tense and the number of subjects of the verb, and Latin and many Romance languages mark grammatical gender differently. Food tongue and other pidgins tend not to do any of this. Food tongue, like most pidgins, does not have a system for constructing complicated sentences. It tends to only be when they become creoles that these languages develop embedded clauses. That, combined with a limited vocabulary, makes it sometimes challenging to express yourself in food tongue. Pidgins also tend to undergo systematic phonetic simplification, but that isn't really relevant to food tongue. Just like with pidgins, there are rules for speaking food tongue properly, although in the case of food tongue, these rules have mostly, alas, been lost to time. There's a tendency to see pidgins as lesser or corrupted due to their phonetic and grammatical simplicity and sociological factors surrounding their creation, but that's just prejudice. In reality, pidgins are very important to the millions of people who use them every day to communicate and are very exciting and valuable to study and have a lot to tell us about the nature of human language. So the food tongue experiment, the ability to create a common language to communicate the meanings of words without relying on an already existing common language, can clearly be carried out between speakers of different languages. But how much more removed can we get? A big part of what made the food tongue experiment successful was our ability to point at things and gesture and act out scenes. In the video game Chants of Sennar, you are tasked with deciphering a language simply by hearing people use it. Interpreting gestures and acted out scenes plays an important role. Is it possible to effectively bootstrap a language in a purely textual medium? The video game The Ghost Doc is a text adventure game where keywords are presented in a nonsense language that you must decipher in order to enter text commands and understand what's going on. Notice, however, that this game already provides some grammatical terms already translated. Is that necessary or just part of making the game funner and more accessible to a wider audience? Is it possible to record a language in a way to make it decipherable hundreds of years later? The video game Heaven's Vault puts you in the role of an archaeologist trying to decipher an ancient language by hunting down artifacts. In this game, your character already has some intuition about the language being translated, and so you're given only a small set of choices for the translation for any one particular word. Again, is this necessary or simply part of making the game more accessible? And of course, we considered the question of trying to bootstrap a language with alien life, where you couldn't even take basic perceptual commonalities for granted. The video game Outer Wilds has a lot to say about xenolinguistics, but doesn't actually have much in the way of linguistic puzzles. Naturally, as mathematicians, we concluded that the best way to establish a common language was to start off by communicating mathematics, and that could get you basic terms like yes, no, and, or not, is, etc. But a good mathematician spends half their time pondering how something could be possible, and the other half pondering how it could be impossible. Is it possible that we had failed entirely at establishing a common language and only thought that we had? In the case of food tongue, there was a simple test. We collectively put together a dictionary to translate between English and food tongue. This was actually in response to the emergence of incompatible dialects, which is just so cool that our little linguistic simulation was able to simulate the splitting of languages. If we had failed to establish a common language, we should be able to see if various members of our group were to complain that the dictionary was radically incorrect. And complain I did, although only that the dictionary didn't fully capture the nuances of how specific words were used in food tongue differently from their English correspondents. But what if we didn't have a language in common to compare with? Would it be enough to have a dictionary for food tongue in food tongue itself? As mathematicians, we started probing the structure of language to see if there was some way of non-trivially fitting it into itself. As it turns out, philosophers have already been asking these sorts of questions. In Word and Object, Quine asserts our concern exactly. Manuals for translating one language into another can be set up in divergent ways, all compatible with the totality of speech dispositions, yet incompatible with one another. We can simplify the situation slightly by just considering one language. Could there be a non-trivial function from a language to itself that took sentences that were sensible in a particular situation to other, radically different sentences that are also sensible in that situation? Quine describes this situation as the infinite totality of sentences of any given speaker's language can be so permuted or mapped onto itself that A, the totality of the speaker's dispositions to verbal behavior remains invariant, and Quine is including here dispositions to verbal behavior in response to external stimuli. So not just language in isolation, but language in response to what's going on around the speaker. And yet, B, the mapping is no mere correlation of sentences with equivalent sentences, in any plausible sense of equivalence, however loose. We could imagine some function that takes sentences in the active voice and transforms them into the equivalent sentences in the passive voice, or replaces words with some synonyms to those words, and those functions will take sentences to sentences that are loosely equivalent to the original sentences. So that's not what Quine is interested in here. Sentences without number can diverge drastically from their respective correlates, yet the divergences can systematically so offset one another that the overall pattern of associations of sentences with one another and with nonverbal stimulation is preserved. These were exactly the sorts of questions we wound up asking about food tongue, and here Quine is asserting that such a non-trivial automorphism exists. Quine is describing a situation a bit like this. Imagine we have a language with just 6 words in it: sky, blue, grass, green, is colored, and is color of. Then, assuming stereotypical color assignments, the following transformation transforms true sentences to true sentences, and false sentences to false sentences, and incoherent sentences to incoherent sentences. For instance, if we had the sentence "sky is colored blue," transforming each of the words according to this rule would result in "green is the color of grass." So one food tongue speaker could believe that the word quinoa meant sky, and another that it meant green, provided that their words for these other concepts were similarly permuted. Of course, one can just point to the sky and ask mango to resolve this difference, and Quine is aware of this trick. The firmer the direct links of a sentence with nonverbal stimulation, of course, the less that sentence can diverge from its correlate under any such mapping. So we shouldn't be looking to concrete objects for our non-trivial automorphisms. So where should we be looking? I want to make a quick note here that we do see a little bit of divergence, and this really falls under the case of loose equivalence in language in the case of colors. The exact boundary between green and blue will differ from person to person and context to context. The exact meaning when I use a word can and often does differ slightly from the exact meaning when you use that word. So that's sort of a negative answer to the food tongue question. My meaning of the word blueberry disagrees from the precise meaning of blueberry to other food tongue speakers. But again, we're not really interested in these sorts of close disagreements. Quine is asserting the existence of automorphisms that radically change the meaning of sentences. One might object at this point. Don't dictionaries pin down a language enough that this isn't a problem? Don't words have definitive meaning? There's a few issues here. First off, linguists tend to approach language from what's called a descriptive perspective. That is, they're interested in describing how language is actually used, as opposed to the prescriptive perspective, where they tell people how language ought to be used. So from the perspective of a linguist, a dictionary is a description of how language is used, not how it ought to be. So dictionaries don't really provide us with definitive definitions. This might seem like a counterintuitive perspective to a mathematician who's used to relying on definitive definitions, but there's really something to be said for the descriptive approach to linguistics. It provides us with more interesting patterns to study, and it keeps us in touch with the way language is actually used. Second, dictionaries define words in terms of other words, so they couldn't pin down the meaning of a word until all the words in the definition had been pinned down. The Food Tongue Avocado Pilaf defines salty radish as meat cake tofu salty radish, cake spinach clam grape sauce. If your understanding of the meaning of clam differs from my understanding of clam, we're going to disagree on our understanding of this definition. In Word and Object, Quine goes into a great deal of detail describing the theory behind how people acquire their first language and how a field linguist might go about trying to decipher an entirely foreign language. These are all highly social processes, and processes that are similar to how Food Tongue was developed. We start by working out banana and spinach, which involves a combination of guesswork and reading social cues. Then we try to establish some common vocabulary by taking advantage of shared observations of the real world. Quine describes how important it is that when I see two things that I call blueberry, they seem to you to be a similar berry to each other as well, allowing you to figure out what blueberry means. Quine actually takes a very mathematical approach to observations, defining concepts like stimulus synonymy to refer to pairs of sentences that, in any context, are either both approved of or both disapproved of. Only with a solid foundation can we introduce more abstract concepts. We introduce molecules, for instance, by describing what they're like through analogy. In Food Tongue, we introduced abstract math words by describing their properties. Pasta water, grass water. Pasta eggs, plantain eggs, grass water. Quine describes specifically the process of working out plantain, cucumber, spinach, and meat by first working out the truth or falsehood of basic sentences, then combining them together and asking if the result was true or false, which is exactly how we introduce these words with Food Tongue, combining true and false sentences together until others saw the pattern. So where can we get radical divergence of meaning? Where could a Food Tongue experiment or attempt to translate a foreign language fail? Quine posits that we should be looking at our understandings of physical theories. First, he claims that there are meaningfully distinct theories of physics that predict the same set of observations. For instance, in quantum physics, the Copenhagen interpretation and the many worlds interpretation predict exactly the same sets of observations, but they do so in radically different ways, describing profoundly different relationships between observer and observed. In general, physical theories consist of two parts. First, the collection of predictions that they make, but this collection of predictions is infinite and unwieldy to comprehend by itself. Physical theories also have to connect these predictions to us, to our minds, so that we can use them. They provide ways of making sense of these predictions by connecting abstract objects like particles to things we have better intuition of, like everyday solid objects. It is in this second feature that Quine claims we can find our indeterminacy of translation. If our physical theory can vary though all possible observations be fixed, then our translation of a foreigner's physical theory can vary, though our translation of all possible observation reports on his part be fixed. When we describe our physical theories, we are forced to resort to metaphor and analogy in order to connect our understanding of them to more familiar concepts. For instance, when discussing quantum physics, we talk about observing, collapsing states, even though these are slightly different concepts in the quantum case than our casual everyday usage. Quine notes that different possible choices of translation might require a more or less complicated set of translation rules. We might need special case handlings to say, when translating assertions involving quantum mechanics, ignore the rest of the translation manual and follow these completely different rules instead. But we already have these sorts of features in English already. In order to understand English idioms, one must ignore the standard interpretation of the phrase and follow completely different rules instead. I make the appeal to quantum mechanics here, and Quine appeals to the theory of molecules, but even our basic theories of classical physics are subject to this phenomenon of having multiple interpretations. The positing of those extraordinary things, Quine is referring to molecules here, is just a vivid analog of the positing or acknowledging of ordinary things. Vivid in that the physicist audibly posits them for recognized reasons, whereas the hypothesis of ordinary things is shrouded in prehistory. He's pointing out that our theory of everyday physical objects is a theory in the same sense that our theory of molecules or theory of quantum physics is. And we can't really take for granted the definitive truth of these theories or the idea that we all agree on our theories of physical objects. Quine gives the example of the theory behind observing a rabbit. We conceptualize rabbits as entities, as everyday objects, but it could be the case that my concept of an entity differs slightly from your concept of an entity. In the extreme, we could view rabbits as unified conglomerations of rabbit parts, or even unified collections of molecules if we want a theory that's nice and impractical to try to predict a rabbit's behavior with, or as cross-sections of a four-dimensional hyperrabbit in time. And so there's no way to tell with complete certainty how someone whose language we don't know conceptualizes rabbits. We can get hints if they start talking about cross-sections of cylinders, and we can figure out cross-sections and cylinders by discussing 3D objects that they probably think about rabbits as cross-sections of a 4D hyperrabbit. But that's all we have, just hints, no certainty. I think it's really interesting to compare this general linguistic phenomenon with the specific case in mathematics. Our hope in mathematics, the thing that makes mathematics work, is that when we define something, everyone ought to agree on what that thing we defined is, because we've defined it in terms of things that we've agreed about earlier. And that agreement is what allows mathematicians around the world to collaborate, able to build off each other's results. Building off results in, say, philosophy is much more difficult, since different philosophers might be using vastly different definitions. But in truth, if you follow these chains of definitions down, you ultimately get to foundational objects, so think natural numbers or the sets of ZFC, where we don't define what they are, we just define how they behave, via, for instance, the axioms of piano arithmetic, or ZFC. In this case, the behavioral properties of these objects correspond to the observable predictions in the theory, and mathematicians can collaborate because they agree on the behavioral properties, on the observable side of the theory, even if they disagree on whether numbers even exist. Just as how quantum physicists who believe in the Copenhagen interpretation can collaborate with those who believe in the many worlds interpretation, because they agree on the predictions. However, if we want to get to the precise meaning of something, like the set containing the empty set or the number 2, we need to specify not just the behavior of these things, but also how we should interpret them, unless you're going to say a mathematical object is no more than its properties. And we can kind of communicate our perspectives here, but trying to pin down anything precise and definitive is going to get us bogged down in philosophy. If you say the number 2 exists, well, what do you mean by exists? Well then, what do you mean by physical reality? And so on and so forth. Quine hints at the existence of another place to find indeterminacy of language. Linguistically, and hence conceptually, the things in sharpest focus are the things that are public enough to be talked of publicly, common and conspicuous enough to be talked of often, and near enough to sense to be quickly identified and learned by name. It is to these that words apply first and foremost. This suggests that there are aspects of our internal experiences that we couldn't possibly work out how to translate. When I see an object that is blueberry and you see an object that is blueberry, we get a commonality of the meaning of the word blueberry because of the similarity of the light that hits our eyes, not because of anything to do with our internal experiences of blueberry. Our internal experiences could be very similar, or they could be radically different. And this kinda agrees with our sources of indeterminacy that we saw before. Through intercommunication, we can establish a common set of predicted observations of a physical theory, but not a common internal interpretation of the physical theory. We can establish a word rabbit for a shared observation, but not a common internal interpretation of the observation. But it doesn't seem like Quine's main goal in discussing translation has anything to do with translation at all. Thinking in terms of radical translation of exotic languages has helped make factors vivid, but the main lesson to be derived concerns the empirical slack in our own beliefs. In particular, one might consider the version of English I speak and the version of English you speak as different languages and apply the indeterminacy of translation argument to them to discover that when I say something, I can't be fully confident that you will understand it to mean what I intended. It seems like Quine's goal is to call into question the confidence, the certainty that we have that when we use certain words, everyone agrees on what they mean, particularly when we use words that we can't build consensus on by pointing to physical objects, including words that are important to philosophers like meaning or necessity. And so we shouldn't be shocked when we have trouble developing consensus on language or communicating effectively when we're dealing with very abstract subjects like meaning or internal experiences, especially when we compare to how clearly we can communicate when talking about concrete objects or mathematics. I'm not sure I fully understand Quine's word and object, and I think that's kind of the point. After all, he's trying to communicate a pretty abstract idea, and his point, as I understand it, is that it's impossible to perfectly communicate abstract ideas. Anyway, I just thought it was neat that philosophers have considered the questions and come to similar answers to what we were discussing back at math camp when we were thinking about food tongue. And I also really appreciated Quine's taking seriously the concept of language as a social activity in which consensus of meanings is built up by intercommunication. So, apple salty radish and now pear salty radish too. Plantain kiwi stir fry and be kind to each other.